So in order to discuss this rather complicated, nuanced, and perhaps difficult question, we have a very esteemed panel here that I'll introduce first, and then they will start the discussion. We have at the center of the panelists, Colonel retired Wanda Rai. She's a director of the Office for Veteran and Military Academic Engagement and assistant teaching professor in the College of Integrative Science and Arts at ASU. A 1985 graduate of the U.S. Air Force Academy, she served for 21 years in the Arizona National Guard and became the first African-American woman to attain the rank of colonel in its history. She previously led the Arizona Department of Veteran Services and was recently inducted into the Arizona Hall of Fame. Congratulations and thank you for joining us. To her left is Dr. John Mark Singyo. Do I pronounce? I always make a mistake pronouncing your name. He's also my colleague in another center, but he is the assistant director and faculty affiliate of the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict at ASU CSRC. He holds a PhD in religious ethics from the University of Chicago and is a public scholar whose work explores religion, war, and human rights. He also brings direct field experience, having served in Afghanistan as a human terrain analyst for the U.S. Department of the Army. Our moderator for this evening is Dr. Chad Haynes, Associate Professor of Religious Studies and founding co-director of the Center of Muslim Experience in the U.S., CME-US. Dr. Haynes is a cultural anthropologist and scholar of Islam, peace studies, and urbanism. He's the author of Nation, Territory, and Globalization in Pakistan and has co-edited several volumes on peace and gender in the Islamic world. Incidentally, he's also my husband. Please join me in welcoming our honored guests as we begin tonight's conversation and discussion. Dr. Haynes.
Thank you. You guys will share that mic, yeah. Just to reiterate, Yasmin was saying, thank you all for coming this evening, particularly such a beautiful evening out and sharing your night with us. Also, just to mention, there's lots of food left, so if you're still hungry afterwards, we can put it out. Unfortunately, we can't have food inside, but afterwards, you're more than welcome to help yourselves again, and particularly the cookies, at least if nothing else. Obviously, you all have your own questions, so we don't want to take so much time because we want to engage you as well with this. But there's so many issues that sort of come out of this film, just about race, religion, and American history, and the erasure of history. But one of the things I found sort of powerful in Muhammad Khan's story, I mean, and there's so many actually intriguing aspects of it, but it's the way he kept returning to his unit and wanting to fight. He could have easily left at some point, knowing the horrors of the war, right? But after he was basically arrested and put as a contraband prisoner, he left, went back to his troops. He was wounded, spent time in the hospital, went back to his troops and continued to fight in the war. So one of the sort of the questions I have for both of you actually is just that sense of one commitment to the military and serving, but how does that translate into perhaps a sense of belonging? And obviously we don't know Muhammad Khan's intentions at that time, but do you think there was some aspect of his sort of service and his commitment to serving that also strengthened or somehow expressed his sense of wanting to belong to the United States? And how do you think the military itself is an avenue of belonging, and particularly for immigrants?
Well,
Thank you. Yes.
In thinking about this, I thought, well, at the time, I don't know if during the Civil War they were required to take the oath, but if they were, that is the first sort of thing that everyone who serves does. And the oath talks about defending the nation against foreign domestic, right? And so I think as an initial sort of entry into the military, that's an important aspect because it's a very serious oath that you take, that you are going to be part of this system that is going to defend the United States. And then I think the next thing is the training, right? We're all trained the same. And whether there's little spots of racism or whatever going on, I still think that um, that experience is the same for everyone. And so there is a sense of belonging because now we're being trained together and there's a sense of camaraderie with our fellow servicemen, at the time only men, mostly. And so then sort of the next step is we go into battle together and we have each other's backs as we are fighting for what we raised our right hand for in the first place. And so I think these are the elements that brings us together and really creates a belonging. And even currently, we talk about our brothers and sisters in the military because we are and do believe we are our family. And I think the same thing happened back
John, you want to?
I concur with everything. I think there's also an element of trauma bonding that occurs. And when we talk about going into battle together, having each other's backs, holding each other when you inevitably cry. I mean, going into your first gunfight, into your first firefight, no one, no matter how much training you have, is prepared for that. You do your job and you get through it, but there is something very human about the transgression of killing. And oftentimes, the bond that folks have in helping each other through that is something that, it crosses ideological lines. I will tell you that I am ideologically very different from many of the people that I served with politically, in many ways, but that bond remains. And I know for a fact that on a human level, if I needed anything, they would be there for me because we have that shared experience of caring for each other in the hardest of moments.
Because certainly one of the things he experienced, obviously, is race. And so, Wanda, I'm just kind of curious to sort of ask you about this, and particularly drawing upon your own experiences, particularly as a Black woman. Both gender and your skin color affect how people read you and react to you and deal with you in the military. And so I'm just kind of curious, based on hearing his story, do you think race relations in the military, how have they changed and evolved? And have they really? I mean, are there aspects of it that are perhaps still problematic?
Yeah, I mean, I think, but you're really starting with the Revolutionary War when we had African Americans fighting that, they wouldn't see their pension. They wouldn't see anything in often cases, and they were relegated to very menial kinds of jobs. And that really didn't change over time. When we think about World War I, especially the Navy having only African Americans serving, right? Serving, cooking, and that kind of thing. And no sort of leadership positions were available to them. And we go through Vietnam, where now we have overrepresentation of race, right? Why? Because socioeconomic issues are and I always think about back to Muhammad Khan, perhaps one of those issues, besides his sort of belief, because the Quran talks a lot about oppressed people and trying not to do that, is the economic issue, right? And perhaps he needed money too in order to survive in those circumstances at the time. We sort of get through Vietnam and we come to sort of present day 9/11, and we see a lot more diversity, but we don't still see people of Asian descent, African descent, even Jewish descent rising up into those big positions. I mean, Colin Powell is one of the first, right? And even today, and now today, we see like today, that our Secretary of Defense is really trying to manipulate the history of us, and particularly women in the military. And so things come and go, right? Race, gender, misogyny, they kind of come back and forth depending on administration or depending on who's the commander of chief and what is the policy of the time, and then sort of what is the culture of the time.
Did you see it sort of like a pendulum,
Yes,
maybe just swinging back?
Yes, the pendulum.
Yeah. I mean, it's really scary. I mean, I think all of us, what's happening, and talk about erasure. I mean, one, hear these stories of, in a sense, minorities that are so unknown and sort of forgotten, not really documented, not really spoken about. And here we are again today in a sense, with a very covert attempt to actually erase minorities out of American history, and particularly even the military. We've seen it so directly.
So many stories, right? Even I think about Japanese intern, right, here in Arizona, and yet we had Asian Americans fighting for them at the same time their families were interned. That's crazy.
Yeah. John, I mean, since sort of getting into this religion question, I mean, race is one aspect of it, but the other is religion, particularly over the last several decades, and I think it's been building up. There's sort of been increasing, at least talk from those of us outside the military, this kind of Christianization of the American military, and particularly evangelicalization, perhaps I should say more clearly, and that there's a politics that comes with that. And so I'm just kind of curious, from your own sort of perspective, both as a scholar of religion and religious studies, and your personal experiences, going through at least observations, et cetera, how do you think religion itself plays, and particularly for minority communities, minority religious communities, how does that play out in the military today?
Today, it's very difficult. I mean, I think that you, as Wanda said, there is the Secretary Hegseth has made overt statements referring to specifically Christian to evangelical virtues. Military virtue is conceived of in those terms. And you are getting now in just recent months, policy changes that directly affect the religious expression and freedom of religion of American service members. Something as simple, for instance, as Pete Hegseth's crusade against the beard, what he calls beardos. It seems such a silly thing, but for those who have religious duty to maintain facial hair, right? Sikhs, Jews, Muslims, right? This idea that this can just be erased, that those rights don't matter in the face of whatever safety policy or grooming standards. That's really what he wants. Uniformity and grooming standards is what he's talking about, right? Everybody at the same standard. And yet that standard that you say is the same is discriminatory in and of itself. The default is discriminatory. And it's without being a target for religious persecution becomes something that is religious persecution. And then the second thing really is the overhaul of the chaplain corps. I served in 2010, 2011 overseas, and at the time it was still a very much Protestant chaplain corps, but the chaplain corps was tasked with dealing with spirituality in a wider frame. Right? There was no Muslim chaplain on my base. There was no Jewish chaplain on my base in Afghanistan. You'd think that there would be in a Muslim country, right? But the way that the so-called War Department is acting now, they've actually decided to overhaul this. It used to be the chaplains were supposed to serve any faith and talk about feelings and emotions and help you spiritually. There is now a move to really consolidate this more into what they call traditional religious expression, which in many ways will be very difficult for those who don't have somebody like a chaplain of their faith. So that's really cutting into religious expression and religious freedom.
Yeah, this grooming standard, I mean, it's interesting because so many parts of the world you see accommodations for Sikhs, who grow beards and have turbans, in the ways in which they're allowed into the military, or Muslim women who wear hijab, so in police forces and the military, et cetera. So many places there's a sort of increasing sort of acceptance and ways in which this, as you said, this grooming standard actually becomes flexible for those who have different sort of sartorial standards themselves, right? Just coming back to something you said, or I mentioned it earlier, Wanda, but is also your positionality as a woman in the military. And that itself is no doubt a challenge as much as being a woman of color. And so I'm just kind of curious, do you see those changes, particularly in the 1980s, when this is still emerging when you first were in the academy, and you must have been really at the forefront in many ways of setting those standards of the woman's place in the military. And I'm just kind of curious if you're willing to sort of share perhaps some of your own stories, or at least your own sort of understanding of how the place of women in the military has also evolved in the last 30, 40 years.
Yeah, so I came in and I was the sixth class of women at the Air Force Academy. The first class I graduated in 1980. It's interesting because we're about to have our 50th anniversary at the Air Force Academy this year. And, you know, well, one, we weren't let into academies for a long time. And then when we were, I feel like they didn't really know what to do with us. It took several years for them to sort of get the policies and the trappings of having women in what was an all-male institution to get that right. First, they segregated us, and then they put us together. And so I would tell you that I never really felt like there was, males there who were really trying to push us out, but they were there, right? And I think at least currently, because of the administration and the voicing of these things, it's getting worse at the academies. That things are being said that might not have been said before to women. Why are you here? And, why would women join the military? But even when I graduated, being in the military, I feel that I had a pretty good career, but at the time we could not fly jets. And then when you think about the hierarchy of the military, whether it's Army, Air Force, pilots are like the cream of the crop, right? And so if women were excluded from that, they could never be in command. And so for a very long time, women were not in command. And that set us back as far as being able to have some of these great positions and to be acknowledged for the work that they did when they were quite capable of doing so. And so I feel grateful that I didn't really experience a whole lot of sort of bigotry against me being a woman. But I do remember when I left that it was very hard for me to get a job. And I do believe that was because the employers who I interviewed with didn't understand what a woman veteran was. There were so few of us at the time, and I can almost see it in their eyes when they're looking at me like, why would you join the military? Why would a woman do that? What, and so it was very difficult to get hired right after I left. And it's not all about that, but I think partially it was the questions about, who are you? Right. Who are you? Like your positionality. So I had, a couple of things. We have, Private Khan was a private. He was enlisted. I was an African-American woman who was an officer. And there was like 2% of us in the Air Force at the time. And so we were really like a unicorn out there, and trying to survive in that atmosphere, was not always easy, but I can tell you, at least from my experience, it wasn't terrible, right? It was pretty good. I had a great career.
Yeah. Glad to hear that. But, this is actually an issue after coming out. These challenges that you face, and we all, I shouldn't say we all, some of us are older, but saw this following the Vietnam War, and this challenge of the vets coming back who had fought there, and just because of the politics and situation at the time, the way, in a sense, they got treated, right? And we've seen this over and over again, and not just in that time, it was just because of the nature of the war, but now people of color, minorities, religious minorities who served, and we see this again, there's a whole dreamers sort of move, right? It's the pathway to actual citizenship was passed if you served in the military. Now that's being taken away, questioned, and challenged by the current administration, right? And so earlier we talked about belonging, but there's also legal standards. And I'm just kind of curious how you see the place of citizenship as its role within the military, and particularly for immigrant communities coming here. Do they see this as, okay, now in a sense, this marks me now as an American citizen? Both of you, for either one, yeah.
We recently screened a movie called In a Box, and it was about Hispanic veterans who had been in the military for some time, who had been deported. And some of it was administrative. Some of it was a little bit of criminality. But it really sort of stunned me in the fact that, we had these people who, again, raised their right hand to serve the military, maybe went off to Afghanistan or Iraq and fought, came home and maybe had some indiscretion, something happened, and they were sent off. Their whole family might still be in the U.S., but they were sent back to Mexico or Argentina or wherever they were from. And and the other side of that being systematically, if their military branch didn't do the correct paperwork for them to get their citizenship, they might be deported. And so there's no guarantee, obviously, based on that information. And so in my mind, even though you might raise your right hand and think it's going to happen for you, it's not a guarantee that it's going to happen for you. And so anyone who comes into the United States expecting the military to put you through to citizenship should be very wary of that.
John, and particularly, I mean, you yourself as an immigrant to the United States, how this plays out in your own life.
Well, I want to talk a little bit about the fact that this is not new to the current administration, right? We might think that, but this narrative of a pathway to citizenship is a very nice one, and it has worked out for some people. I will not deny that. But I want to take you to the case of World War II, the case of Philippine Scouts, right? Philippines is a United States, it was the only United States colony. Everything else is a territory. Philippine Scouts were inducted into MacArthur's army. They were fully members, not of the Philippine Army, but of the United States Armed Forces. In fact, my great uncle Ben served in the Philippine Scouts. My great grandmother drew his pension until she died at 102 20 years ago. Philippine Scouts, those who served in MacArthur's army, were promised pathways to permanent residency, citizenship, and the ability to come to the United States and emigrate. That right was denied to many of them despite the promises that were made. And historically, that has continued to be the case. And in fact, you'd think that this would be a service to the United States, raising your right hand, swearing an oath to the Constitution, shedding blood, your own and others, should be an idea that you've bought your citizenship in that way. There was a young man, another Filipino man in my unit, who was an immigrant. He was enlisted in the army. When we were deployed, he was killed in action. His mother was unable the entire time that he had served in the United States and, of course, in deployment to visit him. She was only able to meet his casket at Dover Air Force Base because of the red tape and the inability of the United States government to get her to the process to even visit her son in the United States. So these are things that continue to happen. And I want to say that it is worse now, I think, with the current administration. And the primary example of that is the case of our Afghan interpreters who served with us. I had one when I was in Afghanistan. They braved the same dangers that we did, right? Endured the same hardships. And now they are being specifically targeted for deportation by this administration. And I can't think of anything else but that race, religion, all of these things have something to do with that.
You raised an interesting point, I mean, with these Philippine Scouts, right? That there are all these stories that are so integral and foundational to American military adventures and to American history, ultimately, that minorities played such an important role. Yet their role is always so forgotten and so easily erased, right? And so I'm just kind of curious now, going from Muhammad Khan's story and stories of so many other minorities, both racial, religious, gender, however one wants to sort of define them, have been erased. Now that we hear stories like this, we hear the stories of the Latinos being deported, the Filipino Scouts, etc. What do we do with this? What role do we have as educators, right, to really do something, make a difference? And not just as educators, but also as citizens of the United States now. What can we do knowing these stories to change the current sort of situation or help evolve the situation?
Well, I think one is to tell the stories, right? Like we're showing this, I mentioned in the box was about our deported Latin veterans. It was just really very impactful to me to see that movie. And in my role as a professor, I teach a program called Applied Military Veteran Studies. And in that program, throughout all of the courses that we have, there are stories. We videotaped, for instance, one of the final remaining 6 888 members. How many in this room know anybody about the 6 888? Not one. But it's a story about African American women, an entire battalion that did the mail in World War II. And she was the last surviving. I got her story in my course so that people can know that existed, right? And so I think that's the most that's history is about her story, his story. And I think that's one of the best things that we can do is to keep these stories, especially these unique and quirky ones that no one's ever told, in our classes, bringing them up, having people read about them, discuss them, talk about them, so that they are not forgotten.
John, you want to?
This is going to be a weird one, I think, coming from an academic, but go to the movies and support films like the 6 888 film that Tyler Perry made. If you look at the narrative of heroism of what makes an American military person, if you think about the archetypical image that exists in the minds of many people in the United States, it is a white soldier, right? It is a white male soldier, looks like, a bodybuilder, Arnold Schwarzenegger or something like that. Captain America, I will tell you, I know a lot of special forces guys, none of them look like that. But supporting those stories, right? And making those popular, making sure that people have an interest in telling those stories, not just in documentaries, but in things that will be widely received, I think is really important, because I think there is a difference between the official policy and the training that you receive at a place like the Air Force Academy and the general enlisted soldier, right? Many of those people, I will say, get their education about Islam, get their education about the places and the people they're fighting and the reasons that they're fighting from popular film. I will tell you that Thomas Aquinas was not quoted once in my unit, but 300 and Braveheart were quoted almost every day, right? And so we need to popularize those stories. We need to make stories like Muhammad Khan, things that are easily called to mind, reference points for the common soldier. And I think that's very important.
Thank you. And thank you both for your comments and stuff. And it just sort of reminded me when we first began sort of this center, one of our explorations or discoveries, if you will, of the local Muslim community was actually some of the first Muslims into the Arizona, Phoenix area is a community of Bosnians that lived in Globe, Arizona, and actually in Miami. And they were miners, but many of them enlisted in World War I, right? And fought in World War I for the US at that time. Right? And there are many other such stories. And in fact, I would like to, actually, we just learned yesterday of another story, more personal. Can I have the mic? That our program coordinator, Fatina Halal, and you can introduce yourself, but she has her own sort of personal story with this as well, related to this. So if you'd like to.
Hello, everyone. My name is Fatina. I do work as the program coordinator for the Center of Muslim Experience. And yesterday, I was telling my family all about this event that we are going to have. And for reference, my family, some of them live in Iowa, in Cedar Rapids, very small town. And my cousin said, oh, well, did you know that my grandfather wrote a letter to President Eisenhower back in 1952 to ask if Muslims could have an M on their dog tags to show that they were Muslim, so that if they did die in service, they had an Islamic burial. At the time, this was not granted. However, he was allowed to have he was given, along with everyone else that he served with in World War II, he was given the opportunity to have a secondary tag added on that did have religion, rather than what everyone else was able to choose, which was C for Catholic, P for Protestant, or H if you were Jewish for Hebrew. And that same year, he founded the American Muslim Society, which at the time, if you see it in any old newspapers, it is spelled Muslim, because it again contributes to the, like we saw in the movie, just that the spellings were not really cared to be correct. And that was a organization that somewhat founded the organizations that we have now. MSA. It later became Federation of Islamic Associations of the United States and Canada, which is where different INSA and MSA kind of derived from. Now, I have also grown up mostly all over the world after leaving Iowa when I was 8. And I've had to answer many questions over my life of, oh, who are you? Where are you from? Where are you from? And I always want to choose the simplest answer. I often just say, oh, I'm American, because I'm usually speaking to people who are not American. So it doesn't seem, that seems the most important signifier, distinguish thing to mention. But now living back in the US, it's become really apparent to me, and especially working here and learning so much more, it's become apparent to me that, oh no, my identity, even if I'm explaining it in just a couple words, I need to label it with a little bit more depth. And I think learning about this story just so haphazardly just yesterday, I think it's probably helped me even with my own patriotism in feeling that, okay, actually, my family is even, I have connection to progress in the United States and progress for Muslim Americans in the United States. And I think it really put into perspective how valuable having education like this and spreading visibility on such stories like this is, because it really can help you feel like your identity is more grounded and potentially feel more patriotic about the changes that you'd like to see. So thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to open it up at this point now for your own questions that you may have with the panel, or just broadly, even, comments that you have that jumped out of you about the documentary, or any other sort of related issue you might like to share, or story as well. So, and just speak loudly. There are actually mics hanging from the ceiling, so they'll pick up perhaps your voice. So, does anyone have any questions? Jimmy.
Sorry. I know you guys were speaking about Afghan interpreters and people that help in Afghanistan with military forces and such. I just had a question because I was at a dinner one time and actually spoke to John McCain's son, and he was doing a big push for Afghans who got left behind after the fall of Kabul. And one thing that I noticed was the primary sources that were coming about these narratives of Afghans who fought with American soldiers were coming from those white soldiers and stuff like that. So when we get those narratives here from those soldiers, or how can I say this? Yeah, so those narratives getting filtered through American soldiers, what happens to that when it gets to us, if that makes sense? How is it altered? How is it conceived instead of it being from the source? Does that make sense? Because when, for example, when John McCain's son was talking, he was talking in a way that made him be perceived as good, which is amazing for what he was doing, but it took and kind of negated the agency or the importance of those Afghan interpreters. So someone who was then a bystander didn't truly understand.
I understand, and I want to acknowledge and affirm the point about agency and the necessity of, hearing a person's story from their perspective, right? There's a language barrier, right? Many of our Afghan interpreters, despite the fact that they interpreted for us in English, the English isn't always the best. So the telling of the story in the same sort of deep way that you could narrativize it if you were like very eloquently Shakespearean in English, doesn't come out quite as well, right? It was a very functional relationship. Now, there are exceptions to this where that you do have exceptionally eloquent Afghan interpreters, and those people are great. But I also want to point out that in the society that we've got, sometimes I'm not saying it's the best, I'm not saying it's great, but having a white soldier advocate for you, the son of John McCain, the principal at my son's school is actually a fellow Afghanistan veteran, and he was the person who brought his interpreter over here as well. There is power in that. And what I want to say is that, like, use your agency, use that privilege for good, and, you know, point as you have to the fact that you still need to then go to the original source and give those people agency. Not give them a voice, I don't like that terminology, but incline people's ears to hear that story.
Any other questions? Yes, Budabir.
Question about, you mentioned that in most of the times, such occasions come when people have to fight against their own people. For example, people of color might encounter a situation in which they have to fight against people who belong to the same identity. For example, immigrants from Afghanistan, for example, encounter a situation in which from the side of American military, they have to fight against the people of Afghanistan. So in such kind of situation, what keeps the soldier motivated to fight for the, I mean, I just want the clarity that how things go on when such kind of identity crisis, I mean, unfolds.
I harken back to sort of the Civil War, right? And its ideology in that, you know, you have those who fought against slavery and essentially those who fought for slavery. And they were brothers sometimes. And they would fight each other and kill each other. And sometimes moms at home would have no sons because they died on both sides. And so I don't know in particular, because I did not go to Afghanistan, but I imagine it's sort of the same thing in that, you know, you have an ideology about what's supposed to happen. Some Afghans believed that Americans were there to help and were willing to interpret for them. And others, no, you don't need to be in our country. You need to leave, and we're fighting against you. And then we have this ideology issue, and, you know, maybe it was brother killing brother.
There's also cognitive dissonance. I mean, I'll harken back not to the Civil War, but just after it, in what the Americans call the War of Philippine Insurrection, right? The Philippine-American War, in which the United States, you know, fought rebels. They were occupying the Philippines, but they sent primarily Black enlisted soldiers there. And there, the National African American History Museum in Washington, D.C., actually really has a wonderful exhibit about Black soldiers in the Philippines and the dissonances that they felt, continuing to follow orders, continuing to be part of this, at the time, American imperial machine, and yet knowing that the plight of the Filipino and what was going on in the Philippines mirrored the civil rights struggle that they were going through at home, right? And the fact is, cognitive dissonance exists, and that will exist for every soldier. And I think there's probably not a single conflict that's ever been fought where that cognitive dissonance hasn't occurred, because there is, I mean, when you boil it down, there is something common to everybody, right? We can find commonalities with whoever we're fighting, and that will be in our minds when you try and take a life.
Other questions or comments? Interesting things, and I think one of the takeaways for me, and particularly working as in the co-director of the Center of Muslim Experience in the U.S., and just sort of one of our driving principles was looking at what are the contributions of Muslims to the United States, and how do we transform the narrative about Muslims, which is so defined by a particular very stereotypical, essentialized, or perspective, or one that's predicated on hate. and also one driven by security concerns, etc. The Muslim as terrorist, on and on. We get these tropes in popular media and politicians, etc. Right? And so by transforming that, or thinking about transforming the narrative, one is we want to do is these positive contributions. So stories like Muhammad Khan come in. We've been here from the beginning, right? Muslims have been part of the American story as much as anybody else has, right? And other minorities as well, right? Have been part of the stories, but our stories are always excluded. But there's another part than just these type of contributions of being, fighting in the military, et cetera, the economic contributions or the scientific or engineering contributions, and that's the values. And one of the interesting things I found in this documentary, in particular, is that letter from the Tunisian, right? Who really in many ways turned upside down the foundational principles of the United States. All men are created equal, by basically saying, but you're not treating them that way, right? And a call from humanity, right? Humanity calls upon you to change your ways, right? It's a very powerful kind of expression, and one I think we might think about the ways in which other cultures, other values, other religious traditions perhaps shape or reinforce or reaffirm our principles that we often lose, have lost sight of, right? So I want to thank you all, and again, thank our esteemed panelists for their contributions. Any quick last words you want to add? Just
a quick story. I was just recently at a Veteran Studies Association, or I'm sorry, Student Veterans of America conference. And at it, I was tabling with the Veteran Studies Association, which is an association of scholars that do studies on veterans specifically. And I mentioned the story about Muhammad Khan. And just like no one raised their hand about the 6888, none of them had heard about Muslims in the Civil War. And I just thought that was really interesting, of these people who really studied this stuff, had never heard of it.
Yeah. John?
I want to make a note to follow on about what you said, Chad, to talk about the construction of our fundamental values and needing to know how that actually came about. I think there has been, especially with the rise of Christian nationalism in recent years, a thought process that things like liberty, things like the American way, and all of these other things have been an Anglo-Protestant tradition, or have been a construction of, quote unquote, the West. And yet so much of what we understand to be the principles of the West from Aristotle and Plato were preserved by Islamic civilization after the quote unquote West burned everything at Alexandria, right? So even our understanding of our fundamental values is part of an encounter with the Muslim world, right? And that we need to make sure that we continue to keep that in mind as you do see more and more of these things demonizing and undercutting the contributions of Islamic persons in the United States.
Thank you very much. And thank you both, Wanda and John, for your personal expressions and sharing your thoughts with us tonight.